When one looks at the history of the Saiyan people, one can see that their story is one of class struggle. Throughout the entire unfolding series of Dragon Ball Z, as it relates to the Saiyans, we can see that they have experienced different forms of class oppression from different sources at different times in their history. Let us start at the beginning. Originally, the Saiyans were on equal grounds with the Tuffles, their neighbors who lived on the same planet. Now, these two people lived in relative peace for a while. This changed when the Tuffles developed and the Saiyans did not. It's not been explained exactly why this happened. Its author Akira Toriyama has thus far only said in the storyline that the Saiyans were too brutal to become civilized, supposedly. Without any further explanation, it may be a simple case of some kind of social Darwinism. I say maybe because there are some aspects of the Saiyans that may counter this argument, survival of the fittest or what have you. Now, the gulf between these two peoples grew quite large as one developed and the other did not. The Tuffles are described as having a very advanced civilization, one that has developed beyond the one which we enjoy here on Earth. From the images we see in the anime, I've not seen the manga, we can see that there are beautiful, tall, white buildings that pierce the sky with many green and red lights placed on them. Seemingly these lights are purely for warning approaching aircraft. I don't know if they have any other meaning. The roads were colored a kind of a bright cream color, and there were plentiful flowers around public spaces. To be honest, this depiction of an advanced civilization reminded me of the Venus Project, a lot of it with its utopian views of a better society. Unfortunately, there was no mention of the civilization's political or economic system. All that has been said is that they lived in peace, a statement which may give one pause when we see how advanced the Tuffles' military is. The Tuffles had tremendously advanced weaponry, something not usually seen in so-called advanced civilizations. With this vision, we can see a possible Nazi influence depicted in this society. There are few parallels between the Tuffle society and the visions of Adolf Hitler. Both had similar-looking cities with a bright white look to it, with sometimes overly large buildings that serve as an eyepiece, and sometimes a social point of pride to architectural accomplishment. A kind of self-congratulatory gift for their perceived or actual superior nature. Both societies prided themselves on the fact that they were so civilized. The Nazis over the lesser races around them in the world. Similar in appearance is how the Tuffles saw themselves as surrounded by the violent and uncivilized Saiyans. The Saiyans were, by contrast, twice the size of the Tuffles. They had immense brute strength, but almost nothing in the way of scientific understanding. They were, and continued to be, violent, uncontrollable creatures who enjoyed violence simply for violence sake. The Saiyans lived in buildings made out of stone, primitive materials that had no electricity. I cannot help but notice the similarities between this depiction of the Saiyans by the Tuffles and the imperial Japanese view of other races. The Japanese Empire, like almost all empires, felt they had a right or duty to rule others because they were lesser or uncivilized creatures, often not thought of as humans. It's tempting to use the phrase the yellow man's burden due to its identical nature to the European and American colonialism. This self-perceived superiority was a very big part of Japanese culture up until their defeat in World War II. The difference in the case of the Tuffles and the Saiyans is that the Tuffles seemingly had no interest in ruling the Saiyans. This may have been due to the fact that the Tuffles already had a monopoly control over all the resources on the planet. They already had the technological, economic, and military advantage, so they never considered the Saiyans a threat due to their small numbers in primitive culture. Instead of seeing them as a race to be conquered and used like the Nazis, British, and Japanese saw other races, they just simply ignored them. Interestingly, they never saw them as a people to be helped either. Often the white man's burden was carried out under the guise of helping the lesser races, only to exploit them and control them. So it's very interesting to see the similarities to the real-life events and those that take place in the story of the planet Vegeta. At some point, the Saiyans attacked the Tuffles for a reason that I think has yet to be revealed. A hypothesis I have is that the Saiyans witnessed the immense disparity between the lives of the Tuffles and themselves. And no doubt they must have noticed their lack of resources, and no doubt this caused their monopolization by the Tuffles. This disparity between the advanced, easy, superior lives of the Tuffles as compared to the brutally short and poor living conditions of the Saiyans must have caused one huge class antagonism. Again, because of the lack of definite information, this is merely an educated guess based on the material conditions of both races on the planet. Eventually, things came to a boiling point, and the Saiyans attacked the Tuffles, ruthlessly destroying every last Tuffle, except for the one that appeared later in the Dragon Ball GT saga named Baby, and their entire civilization. Again, it's interesting here to see how the Japanese Empire eventually fell at the hands of their enemies, who were seen as inferior, and then suffered the events of the nuclear bombings. Once the Saiyans had eradicated the Tuffle race, the civilization the Tuffles had created was completely destroyed. The class antagonism between those who had a monopoly over resources, technology, and living standards had been revealed. All the technology had been destroyed as well. This meant that when the Saiyans wanted new enemies to fight, they were unable to leave the planet. From the anime, it appears the Saiyans tried to get into space, building a rocket, but apparently it didn't work. Seemingly, this attempt to get into space was noticed by a race called the Arcosians. The Arcosians saw the Saiyans as a group of people they could make money off of. The Saiyans had no industry, no infrastructure, and lived in desperate poverty. Seeing a chance to make money, the Arcosians decided that they could use the Saiyans as cheap labor. What the Arcosians do is conquer valuable planets and then sell them to whoever may be looking to purchase one. Of course, we begin to see the parallel between the Arcosians and the European pilgrims who came to the New World. Both peoples came to their respective destinations and removed the populations there to use whatever available for profit. Remember that the settlers began trade with England and the other countries quite quickly. The Arcosians, like the indigenous population, a mainstay of imperialism. Now, Saiyan warriors were very effective in this role. The natural destructive power and violent nature of the Saiyans made them ideal for combat. Since they had no regard for life, they, without pity, destroyed the population after population. The Arcosians recognized, too, the benefits of using Saiyans in war. Saiyans require no weapons because of their ability to use their ki as a weapon. All they required was a little body armor and a one-man craft in which to travel. This reduced their military expenditures. Previously, they had to arm and train thousands of soldiers in order to invade a planet. However, with the Saiyans, they were able to reduce their costs and keep more profit. Here, we completely see the capitalist mode of exploitation. The Saiyans were paid less than the value of the world they conquered, not receiving the full profit from their work. Here it is important to note the unfair trade that occurred between them and the indigenous population of the West and the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims gave tiny trinkets that had little value in exchange for very expensive goods. The Pilgrims would give glass beads and mirrors in exchange for beaver pelts, which were traded internationally for a good price. After having resolved the class conflict with the Tuffles, the Saiyans once again found themselves subjugated in another class-based relationship. With no means of production of their own, like the ability to get contracts and get contacts to sell the planets, they were forced to submit to the exploitation that is employment. However, the class antagonism did not end there. With the influx of private profit, class divisions within the Saiyan society began to develop. Eventually, a king emerged from the Saiyan society. This was, of course, King Vegeta, whom the planet was named after. As a result, there began all kinds of different classes among the feudal order, royal families, and the like. What's not known here is at what point the Saiyans stopped working for the Arcosians and began working for Frieza. In fact, we're not even sure if Frieza isn't Arcosian. So, without an exact knowledge of what happened, I just assume that the Saiyans began working for Frieza and what is later revealed to be his family. Frieza never seemed to be a more loving businessman than the Arcosians were. In fact, he seemed to be much worse. Not only was the exploitation of the Saiyan race occurring, but he was also subjugating and was often very abusive towards the Saiyan population. Now, the subservient role was not to last. The abuse suffered by the Saiyans was not going to last forever. The king was already plotting against Frieza. The Saiyans had an unbreakable pride that would not allow them to remain the servants of anyone. Frieza was not a fool. He knew very well that the Saiyans were plotting against him, and he'd heard of a prophecy that an extremely powerful Saiyan, what's later revealed to be the Super Saiyan, was going to destroy him at some point. Frieza claimed he didn't believe in the prophecy, but he spent time and effort trying to prevent it from happening. The main leader of the group of Saiyan forces, a Bardock who turns out to be Goku's father, is sent with his best man to a planet to take it over, but instead falls into a trap and barely survives. In surviving, he finds out about Frieza's plan to destroy the Saiyan race because of the prophecy. He returns to Vegeta in order to warn the population and the king. He plans an uprising with the king in order to free themselves from Frieza's grasp, but eventually fails. In retaliation, Frieza destroys planet Vegeta and the entire population, except for Prince Vegeta, the king's son, Nappa, Raditz, and Goku. This point in the story also displays a very sick side of Frieza, in that he delights in raising Prince Vegeta in his own image after having destroyed his father in his homeworld. In the end, the Saiyans actually lose the class war with Frieza, with the Saiyan population destroyed. The remaining Saiyans are made permanent soldiers of Frieza and told nothing of how their planet was destroyed. Instead, Frieza tells them that the planet was destroyed by a group of meteors. Here we see a similar fate to that of the European and Chinese communism. As communism came to an end in both places, the ruling elites rewrote history. They invented all these fancy ideas about it just doesn't work, with no explanation, inventing genocides that never happened, completely changing what caused certain events, blaming starvation on Stalin when actually the market had prevailed to provide enough food, and thus forcing him to go into collectivization in order to try and save people's lives. But in the end, they just turned around and blamed Stalin for everything when it was quite in fact the free market that caused it. Now, there's much more I could go into here. We could go into the entire antagonism that exists between Goku and Vegeta. Since Vegeta was a high-born, he's living royalty, and Goku was born a low-level grunt that was worth nothing. And throughout the entire series, Goku proved to be more powerful than Vegeta despite his low birth. That's another aspect that I could go into. And I could also go into a nature versus nurture kind of argument. The Saiyans were all naturally brutal and violent by nature, and that's the way they're born. That's in their genetics. However, you take Goku, who was born somewhere else. He was born on Earth and was not treated like a Saiyan, was treated like a human being and lived a human life and came out a very caring and loving, patient person. So I could also make the nature versus nurture argument from the anime as well, but this was primarily about the class struggle of the Saiyan race, and that's my take on how the history of the Saiyan race is a history of class struggle.